let us start our program. We hope that you all enjoy today's conference, and let us directly start our first session by welcoming Professor Azza Zidane, the session chairperson. Professor Zidane is a professor of pathology, Faculty of Medicine, Port Said University, Egypt. Professor Azza has led many leading administrative positions in Egyptian and Arab medical schools and hospitals. She has also co-authored many journal publications and conference presentations in the field of medical education. She is a referee in the Professors and Assistant Professors Promotion Scientific Committee in the Egyptian Ministry of Higher Education and is a member of the Egyptian Society of Medical Education, the ASM. Session moderators are Assistant Professor Muna Fahim, Assistant Professor of Medical Parasitology in the Faculty of Medicine, King Salman International University, and also Assistant Professor of Medical Parasitology at the Faculty of Medicine, Menofia University, Egypt, and Assistant Professor Muhammad Osman, who is an Assistant Professor of Anatomy at the King Salman International University, Faculty of Medicine, with the Teaching Assistant Haganabi and Students Task Force, Mai, Rawan, and Noor. So let us start and meet Professor Azza. And Professor Azza, the floor is yours, dear doctor.
Thanks, Dr. Fatma, for your introduction. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first session. Let's share a vision. For that, we are honored to have the legendary role model for most medical educators, Professor Ronald Harden. Professor Harden was graduated from medical school in Glasgow, UK. He completed training and practiced as an endocrinologist before moving to full-time medical education. Professor Harden was teaching dean and director of the Center for Medical Education at the University of Dundee, UK, and editor at Medical Teacher Journal. Currently, he is a professor of medical education emeritus in the University of Dundee, general secretary and treasurer of the Association for Medical Education in Europe and UK. So let's welcome our first speaker for today, Professor Harden, who will introduce us to the changing role of the medical student. So Professor Harden, the mic is yours now, please.
Thank you. Can I thank you for this honor and inviting me to join you for this important conference, and to top on one of my key topics in medical education at the moment, one of my key interests, and that is the changing role of the medical student. This, as I suggested, is an exciting time in medical education with an exciting journey ahead. At last year's AMI conference, we highlighted some of the key topics that were going on in medical education. These are just some of the many topics. Featuring very much was the issue of the curriculum in medical education and the role of the teacher. But so also addressed, and something we've neglected, I think, is the role of the student. And it's this that I want to cover in this presentation, the role of the student in supporting and contributing to these developments that we're seeing in medical education. Things are changing. In the Times Higher, it talked about the future is still downloading. And in response to the COVID pandemic, it said, is the coronavirus crisis a chance to radically remake higher education? And I think one of the things we're looking again at medical education is the role of the student to perhaps remaking higher education with a greater role for the student. The student is key to these developments in medical education. Up till now, we've tended to regard the student very much as a customer or a client, or moving now to the student much more as a partner, working with the students as a partner in the education program. This was a point raised by a student in the UK, Sharon Kapadia, when she wrote in Medical Teacher, students as partners, she said, question mark. This might raise some eyebrows. After all, aren't teachers there to teach and students there to learn? Students there to learn and teachers to teach. And I think that's been challenging now. And she went on to point out that at Imperial, they produced outputs, students working with the staff, that led to significant change in the curriculum in a short space of 2 weeks. So students can contribute, she suggested, to the curriculum. And this notion of students contributing to the curriculum was the theme of Catherine Bovell's classic text, Co-Creating Learning and Teaching, students working as partners with teachers. So students' engagement is very much on the agenda. Students' engagement in decisions and implementing the curriculum is very much on today's agenda. And just some catalysts for this greater student participation. I think we have generally a theme, a climate of more consumerism, where the consumer is important, and where the stakeholders are more involved, even in healthcare delivery. The patients are much more involved now in their own healthcare delivery in partnership with the healthcare professionals. In the same way, students in partnership with teachers in the delivery of the education program. We hear much more about student-centered education, where students are important. Many years ago, as some of you know, I described the SPICES model for education, and the S in the SPICES model was the move from teacher-centered to student-centered education, more emphasis on the student, student-centered education. There's also demonstrated, and I've been interested to see, greater interest by students in education. I was interested to note, as editor of Medical Teacher, the increasing number of contributions by students as authors. Way back in 2000, very few papers, about 2%, had students as a co-author. By 2010, this had increased to about 9%. But look at the figure in 2017. By 2017, almost 15% of papers had students as a co-author. And I think this has even increased since then. So students showing a greater interest in education. And in our Amy Esme courses for students, there's been a great interest in students wanting to learn more about education. Interest by students in our Esme courses. Technology has also facilitated, and this has become obvious during the COVID pandemic, technology has also made it possible to have much greater students' participation in education. There's a general climate, too, of greater social responsibility. Students concerned about climate change. And when I was in last year in the US, concerned also with gun violence and so on. So greater students feeling a responsibility and greater involvement in the curriculum. One of the Aspire to Excellence themes is social accountability. Social accountability, one of the Aspire to Excellence themes, that students and staff and schools can demonstrate excellence in medical education. And student engagement is another area where it was identified as important to recognize, can claim excellence in student engagement. Student engagement in managing of the medical school, in the provision of the education program, and more generally in the academic community. So student engagement is very much part of the culture. And finally, this is not just some science fiction or something that's unproven. There now is a lot of research out there, evidence about the proven effectiveness of student participation. That if you have greater student participation, there are very definite benefits. The benefits include greater academic achievement. Students do better. The schools do better if students are involved. And students also develop additional skills that are often in the past been neglected, including creativity, critical thinking, innovating, and negotiating. So there are clear proven benefits now from student engagement. So this greater student participation in the curriculum means that we need to think again about the role of students, and the changing role of medical students. The changing role of medical students. And I want to suggest 7 roles, and I'll briefly introduce each of these very briefly in this presentation. The 7 roles we should think about our students having in our curriculum. As facilitator of their own learning, as information processor, curriculum collaborator, an assessor, a teacher, scholar, and a professional. And students can demonstrate each of these 7 roles. So let's look first at these roles. But I've already described with Pat Lilly in our book, The 8 Roles of the Teacher, the roles of the teacher in medical education. And in many ways, these roles we're describing for the student are complementary. And it's something I said I've been passionate about over the last couple of years, and we're just going to press this month, published by Elsevier, a new book to match the roles of the teacher on the changing role of the student, where we describe these 7 roles of the student, and we'll be launching this at an AME meeting later. So looking quickly at each of these roles, the role of our student as facilitating their own learning. Students have a responsibility, should have a commitment to facilitating their own learning. And this is very much as we describe in AME Guide 58 by John Sanders, and John's talking later at this meeting on self-regulation theory, where students take control of their own learning. So students facilitating and taking control of their own learning. Here, 2 of our students doing just that in Dundee. They're organizing their learning of the cardiovascular system. They've got an online program here. They can decide whether they want to work individually, or in this case, they chose to work in pairs, whether they want to use the self-assessment at the beginning or the end of the program, whether they want to read the text or listen to audio commentary. They can decide when they want to study and for how long at any period of time, and the depth of study. So all of this is very much more about personalized learning, and we're hearing more about this also later during this important conference about personalized adaptive learning. Students facilitating their own learning. And what's helped this greatly, of course, is this move to outcome-based education. We described this in AME Guide 14, this move away from thinking simply about the process to the product. What are the learning outcomes expected? And of course, if we make clear the learning outcomes expected, then it's easier for the students taking control of their own learning. So outcome-based or competency-based education was made explicit what the student should learn. And once students know what they should be learning, they can facilitate how they'll achieve these targets, how they'll achieve the learning outcomes expected. And also helping this move to students facilitating their own learning is the notion of curriculum mapping. And I introduced this idea way back in the AME Guide number 21, a curriculum map that helps the student to manage their own learning. I remember visiting Hossam Hamdi when he was in the previous post, his office, and I saw the whole wall papered the curriculum map for the medical school. If you're coming to the UK for 5 years, you'd want a map of where the different places were in the UK. Well, you might not want to bother about the places in England, but you could certainly want to see where you find your way around Scotland, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Dundee, Aberdeen, and Inverness, and find your way around these different places. Same with our students. It shouldn't just be a magical mystery tour for them. Our curriculum, they should have a map that shows them how they can find their way around our curriculum. Facilitator of learning. Related to that is their role as an information processor. This is increasingly important. One of the challenges we have in medical education is the challenge of information overload. Information doubling every few years. It's estimated in the next couple of years, it might even be doubling every 73 days. So huge information overload. And how do students help process this information? And we must help our students with the most effective approach to processing information. It just doesn't happen. We know that techniques such as just rereading a passage or highlighting or underlining is not the most effective educational strategy. There are now developments in education psychology that tells us how students can better process information, and we should help them to do this. There was this interesting article on fostering the development of the master adaptive learning, and it talked about how we should provide future physicians with strategies for learning in the healthcare environments and for managing changing more effectively. So we should help students with the strategies for learning. That's one of the aims of the curriculum and one of the roles of the students, to manage their own learning, to process the information more effectively. So students as curriculum collaborators, well recognises the student's role in the evaluation of the curriculum, filling in forms to evaluate the curriculum after the end of a course. But it's more than that. Increasingly, we are seeing students as active members of curriculum committees. But perhaps what is newer is this notion of students also as co-producers, as I showed in that clip from Imperial in London, where the students were actively involved in adapting and changing and producing a new curriculum co-producers. In this article, the author talked about how students contributed to the production of an interprofessional education course. Students contributed to both the process and the results of the interprofessional course. And the benefits from that, and more generally the benefits found, are many. Here just some, that by involving the students as co-contributors, co-creators, is a way of empowering the students, the theme of this conference. By engaging students and empowering them, it also improves an understanding, both for the students and the staff, of the course aims. By the students contributing, it clarifies what are the aims, what are the expected learning outcomes of the course. There's good evidence that it results in better quality courses. As we heard in the introductions, quality is on today's agenda as well. Engaging students improves the quality of the courses. It results in more authentic and meaningful courses, well documented. And as I suggested, it also develops in the students other skills, including assertiveness, negotiation, communication, critical thinking, and team working. All benefits. And it results also in faculty development. Teachers benefit as well as the students, with students as partners in the creation of courses. And more generally, what this culture of co-creation nurtures a culture of creativity in thinking about the education program and more pedagogical flexibility, introducing new ideas such as flipped classrooms and so on. So it creates a culture of change in medical education. So many benefits of co-creation of courses, and these were described by Catherine Bovell in the book I mentioned, Co-Creating Learning and Teaching. And then with the student as an assessor, importantly, I would argue, is the student as assessor of themselves, of their own knowledge. Some students do badly, and that should we just neglect it? No, we should try to improve it, improve the students' skills in self-assessment. Because after they qualify, it's only they that can assess their own knowledge and competence in medicine. An interesting quote, If Minds Matter book, it said, we must constantly remind ourselves that the ultimate purpose of evaluation is to help students become self-evaluating. Students should become self-evaluating. If students graduate from our schools still dependent upon others to tell them when they're adequate, good or excellent, then we've missed the whole point of what education is about. I said in the introduction, transforming our students so they can assess themselves, because that's essential in continuing education. Here's a couple on a small island thinking they're out for an afternoon picture, but they haven't actually assessed the situation adequately. And I think we want to make sure that our students have the skills to assess their own practice and their own competence in medicine. So self-assessment is a responsibility, a role for students. But also related to this is peer assessment. It's been suggested that one way that students can develop the skills of self-assessment is first by getting much more involved in peer assessment. Students involved in assessing their colleagues. And I think this is important. Students can assess other competencies that might otherwise be neglected. This is Harold Shipman. You may have heard of the tragic story of Harold Shipman, a general practitioner in the UK who a number of years ago was responsible for the death of more than 300 of his patients. Something I think can't happen again now, but rather tragic event. It is completely a different attitude to medical practice. And what was interesting, I was talking with someone who was in the same medical student class as Harold Shipman at the university. And she said, look, we knew there was something wrong with him. We never dream of sending ourselves or our relatives, our parents or our children to him to look after. He just had the completely wrong attitude to medical practice. He didn't care about patients at all. Although he did very well on the exams in the school. He got high marks on all the exams, but his attitude wasn't assessed. And students are in a particularly good position to assess attitudes. So I think we should be involving peer assessment as part of the program. There's this paper, peer assessment in the OSCE, the number of papers, the importance of students setting up in an OSCE a peer assessment as a feature of it. And students and who were assessing, the students being assessed, all gained. So the student as an assessor. The student as a teacher. Students aren't just there to learn, they can also teach. And the notion of peer, not just peer assessment, but peer teaching. And this paper, another AMY guide by Michael Ross and Helen Cameron, peer-assisted learning, where it showed that this has associated cognitive, pedagogical, attitudinal, social, and economic benefits. Many benefits of involving students as teachers in peer teaching. Many benefits. This is a number of years ago, two of my grandchildren, Rory and Cara. And Rory had learned how to use the computer. And how did he learn to use the computer? He didn't read the manual that came with it. He didn't go to a course in computing. And I certainly didn't teach him how to use the computer. I wasn't able at that stage to do so. How did he learn? It was Cara, his sister. It was peer learning. Cara, his sister, taught him how to use the computer. Peer teaching. So the role of the teacher. And the student as a scholar. The student as a scholar, where the student reflects on the education program. The student reflects on the education program, where applies to the program. Say, is our school applying these 10 points about simulation shown to be effective, as demonstrated in the BME review on simulation? Are they applying evidence-based approaches? Are they engaging in research, in education and other topics? Are they innovating and introducing new approaches? And what I've been impressed visiting schools and looking at the AMY conference, the number of innovations that have been introduced by students in their schools. And finally, are they communicating their experience? Again, I've been impressed by the AMY conference this year, the number of short communications authored by students. And I already mentioned the papers published in Medical Teacher. So students as scholars reflecting on the teaching, applying evidence-informed approaches, engaging in research, introducing innovations, and communicating their experience. Oh, different notion of empowering students.
My dear Prof. Hard, in 10 minutes, please.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, we're almost finished there. As a professional, find as a professional, a professional in different ways. Students' professionalism, their role as a student doctor. How do you demonstrate professionalism as we expect of doctors as a student? And very much on the agenda, professionalism in medicine. And the student also, we sometimes neglect it, they've got to demonstrate professionalism as a learner. What's expected of the student? I visited Vanderbilt recently and saw they had a list of 20 things students had to sign up to, the commitments of a student, responsibility of a student in terms of their learning. What was expected of them as a learner? And I think increasingly on the agenda also personal well-being, contribute to their own sharing with the staff, the responsibility of well-being. And as I suggested earlier, this notion of civic professionalism should take a responsibility also for issues such as climate control, sustainability, diversity, and so on. So I've suggested in this presentation that a key development in education is the changing role of the medical student. And I've suggested 7 roles we've got to think about. These are changing. Away from the student just as a consumer or customer, to the student much more as a partner, where they're empowered individuals taking responsibility for their own learning and aspects of decision making. So I was talking about the student as a scholar, and we're not talking about the student as a professional. And this, then I pointed out that this notion that students are working in partnership to enhance learning, it's a shared responsibility we have with students, a shared responsibility. And this is a concept, we talk about threshold concepts in education. And I think this notion of student as a partner in medical education is a threshold concept. If to move on across the threshold in medical education, that we've got to take on board this notion of the student as a partner.
Why do I stand up here? Anybody?
To feel taller.
No. Thank you for playing, Mr. Dalton. I stand upon my desk to remind myself that we must constantly look at things in a different way. See, the world looks very different from up here. You don't believe me? Come see for yourselves. Come on. Come on. Just when you think you know something, you have to look at it in another way. Even though it may seem silly or wrong, you must try. Now, when you read, don't just consider what the author thinks. Consider what you...
must look at things in a different way. I think that's the challenge of my presentation. We must look at medical education in a different way and the changing role of the student. That I would argue that this is the most important development in education, not just in the past 2 decades, but in the next 2 decades. So this theme of the conference, empowering students, and this looking again at the changing role of the students, is a threshold concept, something we've got to take on board if we have to develop medical education. So thank you very much for inviting me. I think we have a few minutes for questions. If you want to challenge me, could you your own thoughts or comments on this important topic of the changing role of the medical student. But thank you again for giving me the opportunity to share these views with you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Professor Harden, for this valuable presentation that I think broadened the perceptions of many of us about how students can be active and effective members in their medical schools. And I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it's okay. Just remind you by the time. Now it's time for questions, please. Let's now take the attendee questions. For oral questions, kindly press raise hand and ask to the point, please. Okay.
Stop sharing the screen.
Nihal Nabil have a question. I will unmute you, Dr. Nihal.
Please, Dr. Fatma, I have a question. Sometimes we feel that students of the first year are immature enough to give their feedback and their reflection sometimes on the curriculum. Is it a right idea or it is not a good idea?
Thank you. That's a great question. I mean, I think the change, the roles students will play as they go through the curriculum will vary. These 7 roles will change at each time, and I think that's the challenge. But I think that has to grow with the student, and I think even from year 1, students can get involved. That quote I use, Shan Kapadia from Imperial in London, is a second-year medical student. And they worked with the staff and completely changed the curriculum during the COVID pandemic. So I think students can, even from these early years, if you look at these 7 roles and say, which of these roles can they adopt? And it will vary at each time. But I think every year, students can play some role.
Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Azza, I will unmute you now. Dr. Azza, the mic is yours. Do you have a question?
Who is Azza?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
Okay, Dr. Al-Shaima Ahmed, I will unmute you now.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Professor Harden. It's a very pleasure to see you live. Thank you so much for this inspiring session. It's really, it's very inspiring and a great video, by the way. I like it so much. My question just, don't you think that will be a little resistance from professors to remove the power from them and giving some power to students? It's not easy to leave the full power from them. You're going to face a lot of resistance. This is what I think. What do you think of this?
Again, it is a very good point, and I bet that's reality. It is changing the hierarchy and what we're used to. It's not, as Karen Kapadi said, the built-in culture is teachers are there to teach, students are there to learn. So this needs to revision that atmosphere. And I think it can happen with time. And as it does happen, staff can change their attitude and they'll see the benefits of the system. And the real benefits arise from engaging much more students in these different ways. And I think the answer is not to say is it yes or no student engagement, but I think the answer is, as I suggested with the SPICES model, it's not are you for or against each of these changes, it's where do you want to be in that. So I think it's to bring the staff into a discussion with students. It's not are you for or against student engagement. I mean, students running everything is clearly at the top of the ladder. And in my book, I paint a ladder with at the top, students are running the whole curriculum. That's not tenable. But at the bottom of the ladder, students having no purpose is not tenable either. So the question is not are you for or against it, but where do you want to be on it, the ladder of student engagement in each of these 7 roles? Which of these roles do you want students to take on board?
Thank you. I think this is the time to thank you, Professor Harden. It's very interesting to continue with you all the day, but for the time, it was such a privilege to have you here today. So students should not be passive learners. Their potential capabilities are way further, and acknowledging this, the first step to give them the opportunity they need to unleash their power. Moving to our next speaker, Professor Hussam Hamdi, the international Egyptian legend in medical education, with his inspiring talk about the medical college of the future. Professor Hussam is a professor of surgery and medical education and Chancellor Gulf Medical University, Ajman, UAE, a member of the World Federation for Medical Education, WAFMI, assessors team, and an honorary fellow of Association for Medical Education in Europe, AMI. He has established, contributed, and led several medical colleges in Egypt, Bahrain, and UAE. He has served in different senior academic and administrative positions at many universities, including Sharia University, where he was a vice chancellor, medical and health science colleges, and director of the Institute of Leadership in Higher Education. Also, He has served as advisor to the president of Medical Education Qatar University and Dean College of Medicine Arabian Gulf University, Bahrain. He has served as WHO temporary advisor consultant in medical education. He is a member of several editorial board journals in medical education. His work and contributions to medicine and medical education over more than 40 years has been acknowledged, and he has been awarded many prestigious Arab and international awards from UAE, Republic of France, and WHO. So, Professor Hamdi, the floor is yours now, please.
Thank you, Professor Azza. It's again a great pleasure and honor to be invited today in this very prestigious conference. I would like to start by thanking King Salman International University, the president, the vice president, and the dean of the College of Medicine, to thank Professor Khamisi for inviting me to be with you today. And as usual, it's a great pleasure, but it's also very difficult to talk after my very dear friend, Professor Harden. And I was very much interested, and I congratulate you on choosing the title of Empowering Students in the Early Years of Medical School through Teaching and Learning. And I think Professor Harden has elaborated on the changing role of the students. But let me start by saying one thing. The first is King Salman University has a great advantage that it is creating and developing its own culture. And this is a great opportunity because in other universities, if they are changing the curriculum or changing the culture, usually there is a very big resistance. And I think the main role of the leadership in a new university is to help to establish a culture which addresses how the future is going to be, which is something which we are not sure how it's going to be. I mean, we don't have, we cannot predict about that. But in 2018, Professor Harden has invited 5-6 of his friends, and I was honored to be one of them, to write about how the medical college of the future. And I advise you to read the 5-6 publications in October 2018 in Medical Teacher. The first thing I want to say also that medical education ecosystem is very complex. It's a wicked problem, how this inseparable relation between the education and the healthcare system of the country. Not only that, it's economic, political, social, culture. All these systems are around the medical college. Not only the medical college, of course, the all health profession educations. So we are not working and developing things and changing things in isolation. We are all the time affected and sensitive to all these cultural systems around us. The disruption which happened recently, but it is not due to the COVID, but the disruption was happening before the COVID. It was accelerated by the COVID. And it will continue to change. We don't know how it's going to be the work environment in 2030 when you graduate your students and they're starting working. We don't know. Things are changing very fast. And we are not in isolation from the rest of the world. There is this domino effect which is affecting all of us. Look at what is happening now in Ukraine, for example. And before that, the COVID when it started in China, and then the whole world was influenced by that. So the disruption which is taking place are mainly, as you can see, there is a lot of advances in medical knowledge, sciences and practice. The new technology which is taking place in diagnosis and treatment, the fast changing demography, the many countries the demography is changing. In Europe, of course, they've had more elders. We in our region we've had the demography more younger age group, but this is changing now. The patients are better educated by Mr. Google or badly educated sometime, but they come having some information, some knowledge how to handle this situation. Another area related to the disruptive forces which influence the healthcare system is the whole issue of informatics and big data analytics, the global health, the new healthcare systems, where the delivery of care is beyond the walls of the hospitals. We all the time concentrate in the training of our students on what's happening in the hospitals. In many other places, particularly in our region, community-based primary health care is playing an important role. But when you look into the percentage, still it is hospital-based. But we are moving now more towards home care, telemedicine. And all these changes which are happening influence medical education. I will share with you some of the directions which I think are very important, and we have to address them very early. The healthcare is going to be based on a team. It is not the doctor role only, or he's going to be the one taking care of the patient, but how this teamwork, how the pharmacist, the nurse, the healthcare management, the manager, the social workers, everybody is providing some sort of care, and he has responsibilities toward this patient. So if this is going to be the future of healthcare, are we really preparing our students, as Professor Harden, for this changing role? How he's going to work to be part of a team? And that's why interprofessional education is not lip service, but it has to be a new direction embedded as early as possible in the curriculum and creating opportunities which allow the students from different health professional education programs to learn together in order to work together when they graduate. It's too late to ask them to work together after graduation. And I believe King Salman University, they have other programs, health professional education programs, which they have to do everything possible to bring them together. As you can see here, this is in my hospital. These are students from different health professionals program, nurses, physiotherapists, medical, pharmacy, and we develop these opportunities of allowing them to learn together while the patient is the focus of care. And this competency has to start early. The second direction is the academic healthcare system. We are moving now. Medical Education Institute as educational system should integrate with the healthcare system in the country, in the city, in the province, and transforming and developing academic healthcare centers. This will be the norms, not the exception. And even you'll find accreditation bodies for hospital care, like the JCI, for example, they have now 2 chapters, 2 standards related to education and research in order to label the hospital as an academic healthcare center. So, of course, this will go through phases from just having 2 capital I's and maybe talking to each other, but we have to do everything to integrate them to move and become an integrated system where academia, education, research, and healthcare are integrated together. And this needs cultural change on both sides, on the educational side and on the healthcare side. There have been several reports coming up. The JAMA and the New England Journal many years ago, they have talked about the government, institutes, hospitals, cannot handle the training of the needed health workforce for the future healthcare system of several countries. And we are ignoring, to a great extent, the important role which the private sector can play in providing training and teaching. In Egypt, for example, I know that the private sector is a big sector in providing healthcare. I don't know exactly what's the percentage, but at least it is 40-50%. So are we doing something to use them, to raise their level, to become integral to their mission and vision, while it's not going to affect the revenue and profitability? On the contrary, it will give more credibility to the institute, which addresses the role and play a role in educating the health professionals. Now, another direction which everybody is talking about it and doing it actually is how we have moved from course-based to competency-based, but now we are moving to trust-based education, and that's why this EPA's entrustable professional activities are coming now in the picture, because there is a difference when we talk about competency and that what the graduate is able to do versus what the graduate is entrusted to do. Can I trust to treat me, my wife, my child? It's another dimension, but it has to be considered when we are talking about the competency frameworks and competency-based education. And as you can see in this slide, the competency frameworks between in UK, in US, in Canada, in Saudi Arabia, and sorry, I didn't put in Egypt, but I think everyone is very familiar with what the reforms in Egypt about the competency domains. They are not very much different when you look at the competency domains. Maybe the words will be slightly different. But the problem is that these competencies, they overlap. And the main challenge is how to translate, implement, and assess these competencies. I think this is what everybody is trying to find, what is the best way and approach to do it in their own context. Translating this into curriculum, when we talk about the new curriculum and so on, it's not that moving from 6 years to 5 years, is it 4 plus 4 or 1 plus 5, but it's because it's very much related to the context. And we cannot imagine that there will be one best type of curriculum which can be applied to all medical colleges globally, because again, it relates to the context, to the system of education and of healthcare. The reforms which are related to these changes, moving the 100 years old 2 pillars model, layered curriculum, basic science and clinical science, which exists till now, even in 5 years or 6 years. I will come to this integration in a minute, but basically talking about pillars, talking about themes which goes into the curriculum. We are moving and introducing other important pillars. For example, systems and social sciences. I believe medicine is a social science. How this is represented in the curriculum and continue from day one, year one, till the end of the curriculum. The area, the pillar or the theme of technology and data sciences. All this has to be now integrated. They are not going to, when they graduate, to be computer scientists, but they will be working in an enabled and heavy technology-based, and maybe with their other professionals together, they can advance the knowledge and advance and improve the practice. So the new curriculum should have these pillars integrated and interwoven in all the phases of the curriculum. Of course, research and innovation, again, it cannot be just a course in research methodology or doing a community-based research and it stops. No, it has to continue and to start very early and continue vertically in the curriculum. These models of curriculum structures and organization, the integrated model, there is nothing new. Actually, from the early 80s, even late 70s, we started this integrated model and between the modular integration. But the problem has always been this line, this wedge, this line of separation between the clinical sciences and basic science. And we have to break this wall. It is still a rigid wall, and that's why I believe many of the basic science can be taught in the clinical environment. The new students, I think Professor Harden has elaborated to a great extent on the role of the students, the new students, and who are there and their different roles. But I would like to indicate that perhaps you would be interested to read a recent publication about student engagement in the undergraduate, the scoping review by Salah Kassab and myself and Walid Said, which has been published in March 22 in Medical Teacher. I think it is important to read it in relation to these important reforms about the new role of the students. The faculty role definitely will change. And again, Professor Harden has alluded at that, and we are moving now more towards identifying faculty track systems between education, research, and clinical, and how to develop a system based on role. To be honest with you, I don't like the word teaching load. I think it emphasizes the role of the faculty as a teacher, while I prefer an educational load. Although the word load even, it gives me the impression that there is something, a heavy load, we are carrying it above our head.
10 minutes, please, Dr. Hussein.
Yes.
Thank you.
Now, the new knowledge, the new content, all this new knowledge has to be introduced in the curriculum. How big, how far, how the tension between the coverage versus the mastery is something we have to look into it. The technology in practice and education, again, as I mentioned before, it has to be one of the very important pillars in the curriculum. And we have developed here a program where it is spread over the 6 years of the program, taking them to till the third level. I will skip this technology. You all have access to the virtual patient learning system provided by the Knowledge Bank, and many of you have been using it. But again, when we go into the assessment system, how we are going to assess intrastability. And here comes the issue of programmatic assessment, which Lambert and Kiesman de Gluten are talking about it, but we have to consider the major cultural changes which have to take place in relation to this. Portfolio will be one of the electronic portfolio, one of the mechanisms to capture the progression and the competencies and what the student is able to do. And this has to be used as an evidence of achieving the competencies in your curriculum. Again, the metrics of quality and accreditation need to be changed. We are still using metrics from the end of the 19th century when we talk about credit hours and so on. But there are many issues related to how we need to look into measuring of these competencies. A big problem we have, particularly in health professional education, that the students are not all the time in the college, but they are distributed in the hospitals and in the community. How to ensure the quality of that? And World Federation has produced in 2021 a very nice document on distance and distributed learning, which I recommend that you should read. I stop here and end by this slide that predicting the future is really difficult. The challenges and problems are global, but definitely the solutions are local. The transformation is fast, it's taking, and this needs visionary and transformative leadership. And I think King Salman University leadership will play an important role in that. Medical education should be contextual, adaptive. The changes are very fast and flexible to respond to the change. And with medicine becoming increasingly high-tech, training on humanistic medicine becomes essential. And machine definitely will not replace human, but will enable them. I end by repeating again my belief that medicine is a social science. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Professor Hamdi, for inspiring talk. I think Professor Ali Sabur raised his hand for a question, please.
Yes, Professor Ali, kindly unmute yourself. Or I'm going to unmute you, sir.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Professor Hamdi, thank you so much for this very interesting talk. My question is about, we know that competency-based education depends mainly on defining the milestones of a competency. What is the starting point to develop the education? And how can an institute smoothly advance from a competency-based to a trust-based education without making a lot of disturbance for educators?
Well, thank you, Professor Sabur, Professor Ali, my very, very dear friend. And you are asking, of course, a very important question and very difficult question. In competency-based education, as you know, it's a backward development system. So the milestones we keep, this is where we want to be, but we have to take, and this is where we are. This milestones of competencies has to be developed, and in all the competencies. And the example I showed it quickly of the technology in the medical education, how we have developed 3 levels of introducing this technology in medical education: technology, innovation, and entrepreneurship. What happens the first year, second year, first phase, second phase, and third phase. And we try to measure at different points. I believe that students' portfolio from day 1, year 1, it needs to be used and applied where they collect the evidence all the way in the different competency domains. So it has to be something which should start very early, the portfolio, and accumulate evidence. And this gradually, it may lead to the issue of programmatic assessment, collection of data. But again, how to change the culture to accept the decisions based on this data, which are not only numbers or scores, but they are also formative evaluation and feedback.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hamdi. Great honor to have you today. Now, after such great talks by Professor Hamdi and Dr. Harden, let's get a higher boost of motivation. We would like to welcome Associate Professor Rashmi Kosurkar to tell us how to develop students' autonomous motivation for learning. Motivation is a force that drives student learning and academic success. Professor Rashmi is an associate professor and a research program leader for research in education, Faculty of Medicine, Vrije University, Amsterdam, Netherlands. Dr. Rashmi is a prominent ME fellow known for her work in the field of students' motivation. She has many international publications and has completed her PhD on this field. She currently leads a research program on developing students for life, which is the core of enhancing student motivation. So, Professor Rashmi, the mic is yours, please.
Thank you so much, Professor Zidan, and thanks, Dr. Fatma, for inviting me to give this talk. I will start sharing my slides now. Can you see it?
Yes.
First, I would like to start by greeting you all. Assalamu alaikum. And thank you for inviting me here. My talk today is about how to develop students' autonomous motivation for learning, and I would like to talk about it using self-determination theory of motivation. I would like to start with who am I, why am I here, and why am I talking to you about motivation. So I was introduced as someone who works in Amsterdam, but my actual background is that I am a medical doctor from India. I did my MBBS and MD in physiology, all my training in medicine in India. And I was working as a teacher and a doctor in physiology. I was teaching medical students and nursing students, physiotherapy, occupational therapy, etc. And as I was doing this work, I was inspired to work on motivation, and I will tell you why. So I completed this thesis when I moved to the Netherlands, because at that point in time, it was not possible to do a PhD in India. And I'm talking to you about motivation because I did my research work, and now I have developed a group which is working on motivation in students. This was my inspiration. So many years ago, when I was teaching physiology in a big auditorium with 180 students in the classroom, there was this group of students, or 10 students, who used to sit on the back benches, the last row. And after every lecture of mine, they would come and surround me at the end of the lecture, and they would ask me very interesting question. All 10 students were boys. They were all taller than me. And we used to have this very interesting exchange of question and answers. I was very impressed with them, and I thought all these students are going to perform fantastically in their medical education. And I was actually surprised by the end of the year that some of the students performed as I expected them to. Some of them did not perform as I expected them to. And actually, I could see the motivation dropping or dipping at the end of the year in some of the students. This really intrigued me. I thought, if students with the same level of intellect are entering and they're so interested, why is it that I'm seeing different performances? This was a question from my practice that stayed with me when I moved to the Netherlands. And when I got the opportunity to choose my own topic for PhD, I decided to pick up this topic for my research. And that's how I did my PhD in student motivation. I would like to start with which theory I use for studying student motivation, and it is called self-determination theory. Self-determination theory was founded by Professor Dr. Edward Deci on the right side and Professor Dr. Richard Ryan on the left side. They're both from the University of Rochester in New York. And this theory it applies across life contexts. It's not only for education, it is applicable to interpersonal relationships, to sports, to exercise, to whatever you can think of. And this theory is not about the quantity of motivation. It's not about how high or moderate or low motivation a person has, but it is about the quality of motivation. And that means that it looks at what is the reason why we do what we do. So it classifies motivation mainly into two different types. First is intrinsic motivation. I think most of you might be familiar what intrinsic motivation is. And it is engaging in an activity out of genuine interest or enjoyment. And this is an example. So the child is playing with the box, and that is purely out of interest and curiosity. Then what is extrinsic motivation? So anything that is not genuine interest or doesn't come from within is extrinsic motivation. But within that, there are types. So engaging in an activity to please others or because of pressure from others, or out of guilt or shame, that is internal pressure, or for money, fame, appearance, for external rewards. The first example would be because I do something because my mom told me to. Second one, because I will be a bad example for my younger brother if I don't, that is the internal pressure or guilt. And the third is because I want to own a BMW or I want to become very famous. So this is extrinsic motivation. I come to the what is called a continuum of self-determination theory. And you don't have to read everything. I'm going to point out the most important things to you. So self-determination theory plots motivation along a continuum. If you look at the extreme right side is intrinsic motivation. The extreme left side is amotivation, that is lack of motivation. I won't speak much about it. And in the center is extrinsic motivation. And extrinsic motivation is not just one entity, but it has 4 different regulations. And these regulations, so if you look at the part which is close to intrinsic motivation, that's the most autonomous or self-determined part of extrinsic motivation possible. Whereas to the left side is the extreme non-self-determined, that is, which comes from outside. I'm going to give you examples. So if a medical student is studying medicine because he or she genuinely finds the topic interesting or because they like to treat patients, then it is intrinsic motivation. Going to the other extreme, it is external regulation type of extrinsic motivation. If a student is studying medicine because he or she wants to earn a lot of money or for the prestige of being a doctor, which is an external reward, or out of external pressure. It is introjected type of regulation for extrinsic motivation if the student is studying medicine because he doesn't want to disappoint his or her parents. And it would, so these two, external regulation and introjected regulation part of extrinsic motivation, these are very, very non-self-determined or non-autonomous. Then I come to identified regulation. Identified regulation part of extrinsic motivation actually means that a student joins medicine because he finds it personally very important. So he may or may not be intrinsically motivated for the topic, but he finds it very important. And then integrated regulation of extrinsic motivation is the closest to intrinsic motivation. That is when that particular thing becomes part of the student's identity. So becoming a doctor becomes part of his or her self-identity. So if you look at the continuum, you move from the least self-determined regulation to the most self-determined or autonomous regulation. So if we put together intrinsic motivation and the self-determined forms of extrinsic motivation together, it is called autonomous motivation. And if we put the introjected regulation and external regulation together, it is called controlled motivation. So according to self-determination theory, autonomous motivation, that is genuine interest or finding something personally important, leads to better learning outcomes, and other outcomes than controlled motivation, which comes from internal or external pressure or desire for rewards. So this is what I would like you to remember from the continuum. Now, why do I find motivation interesting? It's because controlled motivation and autonomous motivation, they are not personality traits. They are dynamic and they can change. So with the right practices in education, you as a teacher or an educator can move a student who has come into medicine with controlled motivation to autonomous motivation. And on the other hand, with the wrong teaching practices, you can actually move a student who is autonomously motivated, comes in as autonomously motivated, to control motivated. For example, by stressing what they should do on assessments. I would like to talk about why is it important to focus on student motivation? Why should we do it? And I have taken this picture actually from your university website. So the first thing is student motivation, autonomous type of motivation, is more associated or has a stronger association with deep learning approach. Deep learning means you learn for meaning and for application to practice and not for regurgitating in the exams. It is also more associated with higher study effort. So students put more effort into their study when they are autonomously motivated. They also show higher academic performance. They show higher commitment to their work. There is a lower dropout. And for me, the most important thing is more positive well-being. So autonomous motivation actually will be able to provide us more adaptive learners, which are required now in the changing environment that Professor Hosam Hamdi talked about. And I would like to come to self-determination theory doesn't only tell us about the types of motivation, but it also tells how can you actually stimulate autonomous motivation. So there are 3 basic psychological needs which need to be fulfilled for a student to feel autonomously motivated for learning. And these three needs are the need for autonomy, the need for competence, and the need for relatedness. Autonomy means I learn because I want to. So there is a feeling of choice in learning. Competence means feeling capable of learning. So the student, if he doesn't feel that I can master this material or I'm capable of learning it, it is very hard for him or her to feel autonomously motivated. And the last need is the need for relatedness, which means the student feels connected to the learning environment. And that can be relatedness towards their peer students, it can be towards teachers, it can be towards patients, etc. So if as a teacher and as curriculum developers, you are able to provide or support the three needs of autonomy, competence, and relatedness among students, then you will find that your students are autonomously motivated. And that is also the way to actually things that you can integrate into your teaching learning practice in order to support these needs. So first is, how can we enhance autonomous motivation through the need for autonomy? And as I said, autonomy means feeling of choice in action. The first is transferring the learning responsibility from the teacher. So transferring responsibility of teaching from the teacher to learning to the student. So instead of the teacher saying that I am responsible for teaching, it should be the student who thinks he is responsible for his learning. And Professor Harden talked about this, and this is very important. And I would like to give an example from my own medical school. So we have a small group teaching system, which is called tutorials. And in these tutorials, it is not this teacher who is the main, the person who is responsible for everything that happens in a class. It's a group of 12 students, and in rotation, each student takes up a different role, and it is always a chairman who is a student who takes the responsibility for running the session, and the learning responsibilities to the students. So they have case-based learning where they talk about cases and they decide who, what, and how they are going to present the case, etc. So the teacher is present in the session as a facilitator and a person to guide the process and not for the content. So moving the responsibility of learning to the learner actually helps in them feeling a choice in their learning, and that supports their need for autonomy. The second one is providing authentic learning experiences. And what do I mean by that? So as it was said before, that students come into medical education and they are thinking, oh, what is it when I'm learning basic sciences? What does this got to do with my becoming a doctor? And that was the same feeling when I was a medical student in my first year studying biochemistry. I thought, why should I learn the Krebs cycle? I have come here to become a doctor. Why is this important? Only when I went to the second year, I realized that it is required for me to understand this because I'm going to treat patients with diabetes mellitus. And that is why it is important to have these, know why are you learning what you're learning. So if you are able to talk about patients and why, and provide case-based learning opportunities, those are authentic learning experiences which you can give your students. The next is choices in learning. So it is not only the content of learning, but you can also give choices in the format of learning. And you can also do it in the setting of a lecture, for example. So you can ask the students, can we have a debate today? Or can we have someone presenting today? Can you do a small assignment and discuss it with the class? So even in lecture-based scenarios, it is possible to include choices in learning, ask the students, how do you want to learn this? And do it in a different way to provide the feeling of choice. The next is using supportive language. So using may or could instead of must and should is using autonomy supportive language. So instead of giving directions to the students, present it to them as a choice. This is my recommendation and you can use this, but it is up to you. That gives the feeling of autonomy. The next is having trust. So in the class, we need to trust that the students are going to be able to take this up. When I moved from India to the Netherlands, for me, this was a big difference, something that I learned, that when we were doing, people were doing presentation sessions with me, and the students were responsible for the session. So I felt a little out of place when I was not able to immediately come out with my knowledge and tell them, okay, this is the way to present, this is what you do, and the feedback. The students presented and their peers gave them feedback. And I always thought, okay, now how is this going to work? But I learned towards the end of the session that this works really well. I don't have to come up with any suggestions. Most of the times the students came up with all the suggestions that I had. So it is also something that we have to trust that the students can learn on their own with support from us. And the last is giving patient responsibility. So when students are in the clinic, in the clinical sciences phase, at that time, we actually do not give students responsibility. We keep the responsibility with us, the teachers keep the responsibility with them, and only expect the students to learn. So from the point of view of self-determination theory, providing them the autonomy or the responsibility to handle patients on their own can stimulate their autonomous motivation. So these were my tips on how you can stimulate autonomous motivation by providing autonomy. The next is the need for competence. Competence is a feeling of I am capable of doing it. So my first tip is give constructive feedback, and constructive feedback on the task or the work, not the person. So giving constructive feedback gives the person a feeling of I am capable of doing it. So gives him feeling of competence. So, and it is important to formulate or word your feedback in the right way. So it should not be on the person. There's no point in giving feedback like, oh, I don't like your voice, or I don't like the way you look when you present. That's very personal feedback, and it is not useful. It cannot be action. So saying that you did this and this well, and you can improve here and here, that is more helpful for the student than giving feedback on the person. Now, and here I have used the rules of Pendleton, and that's a very nice way of giving feedback. And in this, a student first says what went well in what he did. Then the peers or the teacher say what he did well. And after that, the student says what could be improved for next time. And then the peers and the teacher say what could be improved next time. It's a very safe way of providing feedback. And please remember to give feedback on the task or the work and not on the person. We have actually also learned about this when we talk to our children. Telling children just good boy, that is not real appreciation. You need to say what was done well and what can be improved. The next is milestones of responsibility. So does it mean if there is a difficult task, does it mean that you should not give it to the students? That's not what I mean. I mean that the student needs to feel competent at every milestone. So what you can do is, if there is a difficult task, you can break it into smaller milestones of responsibility. Then when the student achieves the first milestone, he feels competent of going to the second milestone. Then after he achieves the second milestone, he feels competent of going to the third milestone. So if there is a difficult task, that is not a problem. Just dividing it into milestones of responsibility can help building the feeling of competence. The next is provide compliments. And this I have seen specifically in the Netherlands culture, that in the Dutch culture, that people don't provide compliments to each other. So when we did a research on students, PhD students, they actually came out saying that I always get comments from my supervisor on how I can do things better, but I'm never told when I do good work. So I think it's very important to provide compliments to not only your students, also your colleagues, so that you keep that, it makes them feel good about what they are doing, and it encourages them to work further. Then is the right level of challenge. So please remember that if the challenge in the activity is too high, the person cannot be autonomously motivated to doing it. So the right level of challenge is very important. But in, let's say, a small group, if you have 12 students, how can you cater your teaching so that every person feels the right level of challenge? It's difficult, right? So my suggestion would be that you look what I did in my tutorial group. I provided the students who were who wanted higher challenge the possibility to do something extra. So one was, I would tell them that you teach what you have learned to the other students, because when you teach, then you really know your topic well. It helps you learn. It also improves your communication and other skills. And the other thing was, I gave them the option of presenting whatever was being discussed in the class. They had the possibility to pick up any article, research article, and present it to the group if they wanted to. So there were students who wanted higher challenge. They had the possibility of higher challenge. And there were students who required something less. And that also you can adjust so that you make groups of students in such a way that they can help each other and they benefit from each other's expertise.
10 minutes, please, Dr. Rashmi.
Yes, we are almost towards the end. So autonomous motivation can be enhanced by supporting relatedness. That is the third basic psychological need. And this can come from peers, teachers, patients, etc. The first is explaining the relevance of the activity for practice. So the example that I gave you earlier on autonomy, that also works in relatedness. The students coming into medicine, they want to know what they are learning, how is it relevant to the practice? And that can actually be a major transformer in your classroom for getting students interested in what they are learning. And I always thought, and I did that in my physiology lectures, I would always explain what was the importance of what they are learning with a concrete example on how they could use it in practice. The next is establishing a relationship or a group feeling. So the teachers need to have informal contact with the students, or even in formal situations, build this trust and a relationship that helps students to actually concentrate on a day when they don't, like they have exams tomorrow, they will still concentrate in your class if they feel this sense of connection with you. And you don't have to always, crack jokes, or you don't have to always share your personal things, but establishing a relationship and having trust, and sometimes putting your own vulnerabilities out there. For example, giving examples of when you were a student and what you found difficult and what you still find difficult can be a way of establishing a group feeling. And also what I used to do, especially in the online learning, I also do it in the in-person groups, but we always used to have embed one game into the in our teaching learning activity. And that would help me to get to know students more informally and build a group feeling. The next is accepting students' feelings of negative affect. So if you remember the time when you were students, you will realize that when you were students, you also some days did not want to attend your lectures or your small groups. And that is because the next day you had an exam. So if students say, okay, today I don't feel so motivated, accepting their feelings of negative affect is also something that is important for a teacher to do. And then also sharing your experiences. So instead of negating or telling the students that this is not okay, it would be more constructive to accept their students, their feeling of negative affect, and explain to them still why is it important to pay attention today. The next is stimulating group accountability. This goes a long way in getting people to work together. And this actually resonates with what Professor Hamdi talked about, that you need to teach them to work interprofessionally. And how do you do that? So you stimulate group accountability. Not one person is responsible. So sometimes in small group work, what students do is if they have to prepare a presentation, one person does everything and the rest of the group does nothing. And that is not okay. You need to discuss the rules of engagement with the students and say, this is work that you all have to share. And this is how I expect you to do it. And suppose someone falls sick, I still would like to see the presentation because it's a group responsibility. And believe me that students, when they work with group accountability, they're far more interested and committed to what they're doing. So these were my tips on how you can enhance autonomy, competence, and relatedness in the interest of stimulating or enhancing autonomous motivation. And these tips can be applied across different teaching learning activities. Summary and key messages. According to self-determination theory, autonomous motivation is more desirable in students. Autonomous motivation can change to controlled motivation and vice versa. 3 basic psychological needs should be satisfied for autonomous motivation: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And high autonomous motivation is associated with high levels of learning, understanding, performance, and positive well-being. If you can remember these messages, I think I have done my work for today. These are some suggested resources. I have this in more detailed form in these videos that I have on YouTube. You can follow them. I actually give you motivation cases in them as well to understand the different types. And there are other resources. And I will be sending this to Fatma so she can circulate it to all the participants. And I would like to thank my lovely team who have helped me build all this knowledge on motivation, especially in health professions education. Thank you very much for a patient hearing. And I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thanks a lot, Professor Rashmi, for this boost of motivation. I think Dr. Rahab raised her hands for a question. Please, Dr. Rahab.
Okay, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for your great presentation. I have a question. Please give us examples of the games which can be used with purpose at time in order to motivate our students.
Okay, that's a really interesting question. And let me tell you, I did not arrange the games. I asked the students to arrange the games. And students are extremely digitally savvy, so we don't have to do that. And online as well as in person, they know lots of party games and things like that, which can be played in 2-3 minutes. And if you ask them to do it, they also feel more committed to actually playing the game. And they really set up this, as you keep talking about boost of motivation, that's what they get when they arrange the games. But example could be online Pictionary, very nice game to play with a group. Then simple games like, at every 7 and multiples of 7. So you say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, clap. So all the sevens, all numbers containing 7 and which are multiples of 7, you have to clap. These were games that people just enjoyed. So the idea is about creating that informal atmosphere. Which game you play, that is not important, but a lot of party games are available.
Can I add to you, Professor Rashmi, that my talk about interactive learning environments will display some of the game-based learning tools that you can use, Dr. Rahab.
So as Professor Rashmi talk concludes, motivation is dynamic and can be enhanced through teaching, learning practices, and arrangements in the curriculum. Thank you very much. And now we come to the end of the first session. Dr. Fatma, please.
Okay, I'm going to ask if there are any questions in the chat box before moving to the break. Noor?
I would like to say that I'll put my email address in the chat. And if anyone has questions, they can email them to me.
Thank you. It's very nice from you, Dr. Rashmi. Okay. Are there any questions in the chat box?
No, there aren't.
Okay. Yeah, I see many thanks for Professor Harden, Professor Hossam, and for you, Professor Rashmi. Thanks a lot for your talk, and thanks a lot for all our great speakers. Now we are going to move to take a short break for 15 minutes. We will return exactly at 12:15 p.m. by Cairo time. And please be ready to take a memory picture together at the end of the day. Thank you. See you in 15 minutes.